Hi guys, and welcome back to a new video. It's been a little while since I've done a true crime case, but I am back. If you're new to my channel, my name is Lindsay. I do some true crime content, the occasional hamster content, though one of my hamsters recently passed away, which is why my bedroom looks so empty right now. So I did take a little bit of a break, but I'm back with a new case. Not that new, obviously this happened in 1994, but I have been thinking about this case for so long. I heard about it 5 years ago and it's always on the back of my mind, and I don't think a lot of people are familiar with this case, so I thought it would be interesting to talk about it. It's a little bit different, but my favorite thing with true crime videos is the forensics part of it, and this was obviously a huge component of solving this case. So that's why I'm really excited to share this with you, so hopefully you like it. If you're new here, please subscribe. Hi, welcome to the channel. And just before we get started, I will give a little content warning. Now, because this is not a traditional good old murder case, this is a little bit different. I'm not quite sure what content warning to give, though I will say that there is mention of pregnancy loss and terminating a pregnancy. If that is a topic that is sensitive to you, please click out. I have other videos on my channel that you can check out. I honestly can't think of any other content warnings, so hopefully the rest is fine with most of you. So without further ado, let's just get started. For this case, I am taking you back to Lafayette, Louisiana in 1994, where Janice Trahan was working as a nurse. She was a single mother of two, and in 1994, she started experiencing odd symptoms that she couldn't explain as a nurse. She had ocular pain, severe pain in her eyes, and she decided to go see a doctor for that. And at first, the doctors weren't quite sure what was wrong with her. The first doctor she spoke to just brushed it off as a sinus infection or something to do with her sinuses, that it wasn't very serious, and he basically just sent her on her way. Though over time, the symptoms got worse and worse. On September 16th, 1994, she went to the hospital to speak to Dr. Mesa, who did suspect there was a viral infection happening, and he ordered a battery of tests just to see what could be wrong with her, but none of the results were positive, so they still didn't know what was wrong with her, and she still didn't have any answers to her symptoms. 3 months later, on December 15th, 1994, she was doing an annual checkup with her OBGYN, Dr. Daigle, who noticed her symptoms. He noticed that Janice had lost weight and that she had other symptoms such as swollen lymph nodes that would be compatible with a viral infection. Now, Janice did explain to Dr. Daigle that she had already been tested for viral infections and nothing came back. So the doctor actually decided to order a full battery of tests, like brand new, start all over. Decided to just ignore the previous test results just to see if they could find out what was wrong, because this doctor was quite convinced that she had a viral infection. Actually, Dr. Daigle suspected that it was maybe hepatitis A or hepatitis B, but to be sure, ordered the full battery of tests. But on December 20th, 1994, the lab contacted Dr. Daigle to inform him that Janice was pregnant, actually. But not only was she pregnant, she also tested positive for HIV and she had hepatitis C. He did choose to wait until after the holidays to give her the news. Since this was just around Christmas, New Year's time, he waited a couple of days just to announce to her, and I can't even imagine having that job, to announce to someone that they're pregnant, HIV positive, and have hepatitis C. And on January 3rd, 1995, he contacted her to give her the news. As you can imagine, she was absolutely devastated about this diagnosis. I mean, she was thrilled about being pregnant, but obviously nothing could make up for the fact that she tested positive for HIV and hepatitis C, which was such a blow. She had no idea how this could have happened. Now, there are a few possibilities, obviously. She did work as a nurse in a hospital. She could have been exposed to patients that had these diseases, or she could have had it from a previous lover who potentially didn't know that they had this viral infection and passed it on to her, or maybe they did know and they didn't let her know. However, she wasn't a drug user. She never did any injections. She didn't self-inject or anything like that. So that was completely ruled out. But she couldn't understand how this could happen. And it was such devastating news because imagine in 2021 being diagnosed with hepatitis C or HIV. It's already devastating enough, but back in 1995, it was almost 20 years ago. Hi, it's editing me. I just realized I can't do math. And 1994 was 26 years ago, 27 years ago, not 20. It used to be that the 80s were 20 years ago, but something happened, so I'm really sorry. But what I meant was 20 years ago was bad enough. Imagine 26 years ago. Things were so different. It was definitely a death sentence. Although she was thrilled about the pregnancy, she had to make the very difficult decision to terminate it because she had no idea if she would be passing on the HIV virus to her child. And although she did want to continue with the pregnancy, she had to give that up, which just adds to the trauma. That was the only positive aspect of the diagnosis, of the lab results, and she couldn't even have that. Of course, as it is routine for any HIV diagnosis, you would usually have to contact your previous partners just to see if maybe they could be the source, or just to inform them that you have this diagnosis and that they should get checked as well. However, when they spoke to her previous partners, none of them tested positive for HIV, so it couldn't have been from a previous partner. She didn't have a current partner at the moment, so it couldn't have been from that. And on top of that, she really wasn't exposed to HIV positive patients that often in the hospital. So the odds of her getting this viral infection and hepatitis C seemed so slim. And I think she genuinely expected one of her previous partners to test positive. That would be the most reasonable explanation, and it would give her at least some peace of mind as to how she could have gotten this. One of her previous partners actually happened to be her primary care physician, Dr. Richard Schmidt. And she met him years ago when they both started working at the same hospital. He was working as a doctor. She had just graduated nursing school, and she was just working there as a nurse. They actually were both married at the time. She was married with kids, and he was also married. He had 3 children. And they started out as friends, but they really got along. And she really admired just how knowledgeable he was, just how good of a doctor he was. He was obviously very smart, and she really looked up to him. And as their friendship grew, it slowly turned into an affair. So over time, they slowly started seeing each other romantically, and they were slowly making plans to leave their respective spouses just so that they could be together. So the plan was for Janice to divorce her husband and for Richard Schmidt to leave his wife, and that way they could be together and get married. And Janice took it seriously. She actually did leave her husband. She divorced her husband at the time to be with Dr. Schmidt. However, he never really left his wife. He wasn't holding up his end of the deal. Now, what's very troubling with this relationship, which already is problematic because she's left her husband, he's not leaving his wife, and on top of that, he did not like using condoms, which is, especially as a doctor, like, oh, I could make a whole video about how I hate hearing that excuse. But he did not like using a condom, and she could not use birth control or the pill because it gave her really, really bad migraines, which is, you know, a lot of women react poorly to the pill, so I completely understand why she wouldn't want to be on that. But he also didn't like her using a diaphragm, so no contraception, no safety involved, like no safe sex. This is a doctor and a nurse, but we're in the 90s, and what's so messed up is that she ended up becoming pregnant 4 times by Dr. Schmidt. Meanwhile, he's still with his wife. And 3 of those times, he pressured her into getting an abortion, which is so insane to me. Just how messed up is that? I have no idea. She never spoke about this in the interviews, but I have no idea how she felt about this. But imagine getting pregnant and being pressured into giving up a child that you might want. I mean, she probably was happy to have kids. I mean, she did want to be with him, but obviously that would absolutely ruin his family life, and we wouldn't want that now, would we? Especially as a doctor, it would probably just make him look bad. But on the 4th pregnancy, she refused to get an abortion and she kept the child. And in 1991, she gave birth to their son, Jeffrey. What's insane as well is that he actually paid child support. He was still with his wife and kids, and he paid child support for Jeffrey. And I don't know how much his wife knew at the time, but maybe she didn't have control of finances, but imagine wondering like where the money's going. It's just, oh, that's my mistress's son. So in a way, I guess you could say he did pay child support, but that was a bit wild to me that he still wasn't leaving his wife. He wasn't leaving his family. And she did try to leave the relationship quite a few times, just because obviously he wasn't planning on leaving his wife. He made it very clear, and that was the whole point in the first place. She wanted to be with him. He showed no interest to be serious with her. So she tried to leave quite a few times, but whenever she tried to leave, he would make threats against her. He said that he would put sexually revealing pictures on the bulletin board all around the hospital so all the colleagues could see her naked. He threatened to call the nursing school she went to, University of Southwestern Louisiana, to say that she had plagiarized her reports, her assignments, that she had allowed him to write them for her. And he actually did follow through on that threat. He had actually contacted the university anonymously to say that she had let him write the assignments on her behalf. And they did investigate. Obviously, they take that very seriously. And they came back with the conclusion that there was nothing to prove that she had actually cheated. She was a very good nurse. She was very knowledgeable. She obviously never did that. So nothing came of it. But he was very serious about these threats. And even when she tried to date other men, she's like, fine, you don't want to leave me alone, but I'm still going to try and date other men. And he would stalk her going on dates. He would find out where the men she was dating lived. He even showed up at one guy's place and threatened to kill him if he kept seeing Janice, which is absolutely insane. I mean, it's such an abusive relationship. So yes, she did try to leave, but every time she tried, he would threaten her. He would just make her life absolute hell. So she could never meet new people. They would get stalked. They would get threatened. And if she tried to leave, she was essentially blackmailed. And it got to the point where she really wanted to leave, but she was too scared to leave because she was terrified. He even told her, if you leave me, I'll fix it so no other man will ever want you. Which, as terrifying as it was, she still found the strength to just give him an ultimatum. She said, you can either leave your wife and marry me, or we're done. We're absolutely done. This is it. Just leave me alone forever, basically. And you might wonder why she would even still offer, like, oh, leave your wife and marry me as an option. I'm not sure if she called his bluff. I don't know if she offered that as an option, knowing that he wasn't going to do that, or maybe she was still stuck in an abusive mentality, abusive relationship, and maybe she still did want to make it work with him. That's just my opinion. That's just my theory, is maybe she thought that if he did leave his wife to be with her, then he would change, that he wouldn't need to threaten her anymore because they would be together, basically. Either way, it doesn't matter. He never really got back to her on that ultimatum, so she called it quits, and on July 19th, 1994, she saw him for the last time, and she also stopped using him as her primary care physician, obviously. As her primary care physician previous to that, he would often give her B12 injections because she suffered with a low energy. She would feel lethargic a lot of the time. And in July 1994, before she broke up with him, she actually received 3 series of shots of vitamin B12. But on August 4th, 1994, after the breakup, she received a call after 10 p.m. It was between 10 and 11 p.m. She was actually already in bed. She was asleep with her son, Jeffrey, who was 3 years old at the time. And she picked up the phone, but she was still very sleepy. And it was Dr. Schmidt saying that he was coming over right away. Now, she barely had time to process what was going on because next thing she knew, he was inside her house. She explained to him that she did not want to do this injection right now. He was coming over to give her a B12 injection again. And she said, you know what, this can definitely wait until the morning. What are you doing here? I'm not comfortable with this. But before she knew it, he injected her in the arm. And it was such a painful injection. She had never received an injection that painful ever before. And usually after any injection he would give her, he would kind of stick around, chit chat. It was definitely normal for him to come to her house to give the injection, but he would usually stay behind and chit chat or have a conversation. But this time he felt very rushed. He didn't want to stay. He was very nervous. Now, to be fair, they had broken up, so it makes sense that he wouldn't want to stick around and chat. But he did tell her that he had to go to the emergency room at the Hamilton Medical Center because he was working there that night. And before she knew it, he was gone again. He was there for less than a few minutes. And the shot was hurting her so bad, it continued to hurt throughout the night, to the point where she thought she would need to go to the hospital to have it examined by a doctor. And she decided to call the emergency room at the Hamilton Medical Center, where he claimed he was going back to work. But she found out that he wasn't there. All the staff said, no, Dr. Schmidt isn't in tonight. Sorry. And she didn't go to the emergency room that night. She ended up just waiting it out. But the next day, she wanted to confront him about his whereabouts, because she said, well, you said you were going to be back at the emergency room. I tried to contact you there, but the staff said you weren't there. He said, oh, don't worry. I was on the 3rd floor. I was working on a different floor that night. So that's why they didn't know I was there, but I was definitely at the hospital. And when she confronted him about the painful shot, he said that he was sorry. He apologized and said that he would never give her another shot in the dark. I know you're already adding 2 and 2 together, but obviously at the time even she thought it was incredibly bizarre and concerning, to the point where she actually spoke to a colleague the next day to let her know about the injection. She was so suspicious of it that she knew she wanted someone to know about it, so that if anything came of it, a colleague could say, actually, she did mention that Dr. Schmidt came over that night to give her an injection of B12. However, even Janice told her colleague that she didn't believe it was a B12 injection. By the time she got diagnosed with HIV and hepatitis C, Dr. Schmidt was going around his hospital telling colleagues that she tested positive because she was a slut, because she sleeps around, she would bring strange men home, she would go to the bar at night, meet strange people, she would even go to the bar during the day, she couldn't help herself, and that's why she got it. Basically, he said that he thought she got HIV because she was sleeping around with strange men, and first of all, incredibly unprofessional behavior. I mean, I'm not sure who she told about this, but surely there's some sort of patient confidentiality issue here. If he's going around the hospital talking trash about his ex, but also very concerning given the circumstances. And what's interesting is obviously when she got the diagnosis back and they had to contact her previous partners, the doctor she was seeing at the time was friends with Dr. Schmidt, and because he knew him, he decided to speak to Dr. Schmidt directly. I know if I had such a diagnosis, I would not want to be the one making the phone calls. I'm not sure what the procedure was at the time, but Dr. Daigle spoke to Dr. Schmidt, pulled him aside and said, look, you need to know Janice Trahan tested positive for HIV. You should get tested. And when he first heard the news, he was absolutely shocked. He appeared very shocked. He couldn't believe it. And when he was told that he needed to get tested as well, he said, actually, you know what? It's fine. I know I'm not HIV positive. I don't need to be tested. I feel fine. If you know anything about this type of infection, feeling fine does not mean anything, especially as a doctor. He knows that. I don't know if Dr. Daigle thought, all right, like if someone comes up to me and says one of your previous partners tested positive for HIV, I'm booking the test like 2 minutes later. I don't care if I feel fine or not. So obviously, what does he know that we don't know? And Janice refused to believe that this was just a coincidence. A couple of months later, she spoke to the district attorney of Lafayette, Louisiana, Mike Carson, and she told him that she believed that the B12 injection was actually tainted blood that was tainted with HIV, with the virus, and that's how she ended up contracting HIV. And of course, you can imagine the district attorneys thinking, this is too crazy to be real. This can't possibly be a real theory, because to him it just sounded like she was a nurse trying to get back to a doctor, a mistress trying to get back to her lover. He didn't leave his wife to be with her. She has his son, but he still won't leave his wife and kids to be with her. and she's trying to discredit him. I mean, this is a doctor who's respected. His patients love him. He's a very good doctor. He has very good status. This is not just a random guy walking around the street. This is someone who most people believe. So it made her look very bad, but obviously Mike Carson couldn't just completely dismiss what she was telling him, because as crazy as it sounded, it also sounded crazy, like so crazy that he had to look into it. So he actually did assign a detective to the case, Detective Jim Kraft. And the first thing to do was to find out if she had contracted the virus prior to August 4th, 1994, or if it was a recent infection. And luckily she had donated blood a couple of months prior to August 4th, 1994. And when they contacted the blood donation center, they obviously have to test the blood before they dispatch it. That's just procedure. They need to make sure that the blood is healthy, I guess. And they spoke to Jim Kraft and said that the blood did not test positive for HIV at the time. So the infection was definitely recent, which did add a little bit of weight to her theory, because if it had tested positive back then it would be completely dismissed. However, it wasn't. So they decided to dig a little deeper, and the next step was obviously to check the phone records for Richard Schmidt on the night of the 4th, since she said that he called her between 10 and 11 to tell her he was on his way. When he checked the phone records, it did show a phone call at 10:26 p.m. to Janice Trahan's house, which just confirmed that he did place that call. It doesn't prove anything else, but it proves that she wasn't lying about the phone call either. Obviously, they still need to prove that somehow it was this injection on August 4th, 1994 that led to her contracting HIV, which was going to be almost impossible to prove, honestly, especially since the HIV virus is not easy to find. You can't just walk into a blood clinic or a blood donation center and say, do you have any blood that tested positive for HIV? Can I have a vial? It's not something you can just find easily. And even if you could, the virus itself is only stable, or can only survive for 12 hours outside of the host, outside of the body, basically. So it gives you a very, very short window to operate on. You have to act very quickly if your intention is to use that blood for anything. So Jim Kraft did the next logical thing, was to search through the medical records that Richard Schmidt kept. They tried to find if there were any blood withdrawals on the 4th of August, but when they were looking for the 1994 records in his office, there were none. They had just gone missing. He had every other year, but 1994 was just gone in the wind. Somehow, something must have happened to them. You know how it is. You just lose your medical records as a doctor. So obviously that wasn't looking good for him. And they couldn't, obviously, because they didn't have the medical records, they couldn't find any trace of injection that he gave Janice, but they also couldn't see if he had withdrawn any blood that day. If he had drawn any blood? If any of his patients had their blood drawn that day, that's what we'll say. So they kept looking around his office, and actually, instead of finding the 1994 records, what they did find was pictures, the revealing pictures of Janice that Richard Schmidt had taken in his top drawer of his desk. In the top drawer of his desk, just lying there casually as any doctor would have, which again adds a little bit of weight to the threats he had made to her, saying that he was going to reveal put these revealing pictures on the bulletin boards. He definitely shouldn't have had those pictures. So again, another thing that looks very bad for Dr. Schmidt. But they didn't stop there. They kept searching around the office, and they ended up finding a storage room behind his office in the back that was quite concealed. And when they got there, there were quite a few boxes, and they searched through every single one of them. And in a box labeled 1992 or 1992 records, they found a notebook at the very bottom of that box, and the last entry on that notebook was for August 4th, 1994. The notebook consisted of all the names of patients whose blood was drawn on that day, and every patient had a little tracking number or like a number reference next to it on a sticker, just like you would if you send samples to a lab. That way they know which samples is whose. They usually only have tracking numbers on them just so that they can track them back, obviously. However, there was one patient who didn't have a tracking number next to his name, and the patient was Don McClellan. And police needed to know if that was just a coincidence, because why would you draw blood if you can't send it to the lab? Why would there be a tracking number missing? Because instead of the tracking number, it only said lavender stopper for Dr. S. Of course, police went to speak to Don McClellan immediately, and they had to ask him a very personal question. Obviously, the first question they wanted answered was whether or not he was HIV positive. And he told them, HIV positive? I've got full-blown AIDS. And he actually even told police that usually whenever Dr. Schmidt would draw blood from him or do a blood test, it would be in a calendar. It would be a planned meeting, it would be a planned appointment, and he would go there regularly. Obviously, you need to be followed quite closely if you have HIV, let alone AIDS, by a doctor. And on that day, he didn't have an appointment. However, Dr. Schmidt still called him, asking him to come in for a blood test. And this is the most difficult part of the case as well, is trying to prove or trying to find out if Don McClellan has anything to do with Janice's diagnosis, basically. Because the problem with testing virus DNA compared to human DNA is that virus DNA will mutate and evolve once it's inside a body, and it will be very different from person to person. So it's very hard to compare two viruses, because obviously even if it's the same virus, it will evolve and mutate and change over time. But they decided to bring in Dr. Michael Metzger, who was one of the experts who decided to use phylogenetic methods, which I will read this to you. Phylogenetic methods is basically trying to establish a degree of relationship between viruses. I'm sure there's a lot more science behind this explanation, but to make it simple, basically it's to try and see if there's any link between viruses. And Dr. Metzger decided to take 30 samples from HIV positive patients in the Lafayette region, including Janice and Don. They were 2 of the 30 samples involved, and they decided to compare them, to study them. And it turned out that 28 of the samples had mutated in wildly different ways, just very, very different ways, but 2 of the samples were nearly identical. And as you can imagine, these were obviously Dawn and Janice's samples. And there was quite a lot of controversy at the time with this method being used, because any case that gets solved with a new scientific method is going to be questioned, because it's the first time. Can we trust this? Is this reliable? Is this biased? Is this true? Is this real? And a lot of the defense obviously argued that it was impossible to compare viruses just because of their nature. So they had to bring in a third party who basically tried to replicate the experiment to see if the results would be the same. And they came to the conclusion that there was a 1 in a million chance that Janice and Dawn's samples weren't related. But if you remember, Janice didn't only test positive for HIV, she also got tested for hepatitis C. And Don McClellan actually did not have hepatitis C. So if it was Dawn's blood that was injected in Janice's arm and caused her to contract HIV, how could she have hepatitis C? This is not something you can just catch easily. So it definitely raised the question as to how she could possibly get hepatitis C if they believe that Dawn's blood was the source of the HIV virus. So they went back to the records, the medical records in Dr. Schmidt's office, and they found 1 more patient with no lab sticker or no tracking reference. And the reason they had somewhat missed this in the first place was because this happened on August 2nd, 1994. They were looking mostly at August 4th because of that 12-hour window for the HIV virus. It would have to be on the same day. But when they looked at August 2nd and they saw that another patient didn't have a tracking reference or a tracking number next to its name, they realized that that blood sample never made its way to the lab. And when they checked the medical records of that patient, they found out that she had hepatitis C, which means that Dr. Schmidt would have had to get his hands on the hepatitis C blood sample and waited until he could get a sample of HIV tainted blood to mix the two together to inject Janice with in a very short period of time, which is also like one of the most lethal cocktails you can come up with. As you can imagine, Dr. Schmidt said he was innocent and that he actually had an alibi for that night. He was with his wife the whole night. Well, except for 20 minutes where she took a bath. And that's not a very long time. 20 minutes is definitely like a short window of time, but police decided to test out the theory. Maybe in 20 minutes they could drive from Dr. Schmidt's place to Janice's place, back and forth, with time to give the injection. And when the detectives tried this, they actually drove to Janice's house and back in 17 minutes. Which would give 3 minutes to give her the injection, which would be consistent with her story that he left in a rush. He was very, very quick to leave. And to add a few messed up details to this is originally when Janice spoke to one of the doctors who suspected a viral infection and they did the battery of tests, that doctor spoke to Dr. Schmidt because he was her primary care physician at the time, and he informed the doctor that Janice had just been tested for HIV and the results were negative, so there would be no need to test for it. And the doctor actually wrote that down in her records, HIV negative, because obviously he trusted the primary care physician's words. Dr. Schmidt, he respected Dr. Schmidt. Why would he lie about that? And he would know more about Janice's records because he's her actual doctor. And if he hadn't lied, like that's so, I mean, everything he's done is incredibly cruel, but if he hadn't lied, they could have detected it a lot earlier, which in 1995, I believe would have made, I mean, even these days, it would have made a difference. The sooner you can detect this, the sooner you can start treating it. And that definitely made him look very bad in court. And with all of this evidence put together, the state argued that the similarities in the manner in which blood was drawn from the hepatitis C patient and Don McClellan established Richard Schmidt's motive, opportunity, intent, preparation, plan, knowledge, identity, and absence of mistake or accident. And the jury didn't need anything more. They only deliberated for a couple of hours. And in July 1996, Dr. Schmidt was charged with attempted second-degree murder and sentenced to 50 years hard labor. And it's because HIV is maybe not so much anymore, but back in 1995, it was definitely a death sentence. And that's why it was attempted second-degree murder. He had made the threat to her that he would fix her so that no other man could have her or would want her, and he followed through on that threat, especially as a doctor who took the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. That is absolutely cruel and insane. And as the judge said, it was one of the strangest and cruelest crimes he had ever heard of. And I have to agree, to be honest, part of the reason why I love this case is because this could have easily gone unsolved, very easily. But the fact that they managed to get so much information and even use a new method to solve a crime, which was the phylogenetic methods, no case had ever been solved this way before. The fact that they could bring a new method to solve this and get justice for Janice. Even now, there is no cure for HIV or AIDS. The quality of life of these patients has obviously gone up drastically, but it severely altered her lifestyle. She lost her career as a nurse. She was no longer allowed to practice as a nurse because of her diagnosis. She suffered huge financial loss. Not even just her, even Don McClellan, he had no intention of letting his diagnosis be known to the public, but because he had to be dragged into this case and he was obviously crucial to solving this case, now his diagnosis was public and it affected his life. Of course it did. And I'm happy to say that in 2015, after 17 years served of his 50-year sentence, he was unanimously denied parole, which makes me very happy. To be honest, I feel like 50 years of hard labor isn't enough. I think they tried to argue that he had a family to take care of, or like his kids needed financial support. So if he was just sentenced to death or have a life sentence, then the whole family would suffer as a result. I can understand the reasoning, but to be honest, I personally feel like 50 years hard labor is nothing. For what he's done, it's absolutely nothing. And what blows my mind is that his wife chose to stay by his side. She thinks he's innocent. She thinks the testing, the research methods used in solving this case are absolutely like bogus. And she's waiting for him to basically be done with his sentence so that they can be together again. And it's just like, she's an adult. She can make that decision for herself. If she wants to support him and justify his actions or say he's innocent, that's on her. Because Janice actually has a son with Richard, and that's very easy to prove. If you didn't believe that, you could still get a blood test, a DNA test, and prove that he's the father. And he's not denied that. He paid child support for Jeffrey. And it just blows my mind that alone wasn't enough for his wife to be like, whoa. And then to be dragged into court for something he definitely did, on top of the death threats. I mean, everything about him is just absolute, like a dumpster fire of just garbage personality and behavior. And she just sits at home being like, no, like, I just can't believe that the court went this way. Like, it's an absolute shame that he's in jail. Yeah, she's lost me there. But again, that is her decision. If she wants to do that, that's absolutely fine by me. But on a more positive note, Janice has since remarried and she seems to be okay. There have been many improvements to the quality of life of HIV positive patients, and she said she has a good outlook on life and that she treasures each day that she has with her family, which is honestly the best outcome we could hope for. I hope she's doing okay. I hope that she's healthy. I hope that she's doing fine and that she can have a long, healthy, happy life, honestly, because that must be one of the most traumatic events you can go through. Because I would have such a hard time trusting any doctor after this, even though obviously that was quite a specific situation. I genuinely, I think about her a lot. Like, I've heard about this case 5 years ago, and it's every once in a while, and I genuinely can't believe this happened sometimes. I'm definitely amazed at the research and the forensics and the evidence they managed to find, and that the jury was very happy to embrace this new method of testing, just because it can be very controversial when it's used for the first time. But that's it for today's case. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you've ever heard of this before. I don't think I've seen many people talk about this, just because obviously it's a little bit different, but it's one I really wanted to share with you guys, and I've been off for a couple of weeks. So yeah, I'm excited to be back, and I will see you next week in another video. Bye.